Disappearance of Ylenia Carrisi, the girl who walked away from paradise. January 6th, 1994. Somewhere in New Orleans, a 23-year-old woman vanished. She left behind her clothes, her notebooks, her camera, her passport, almost everything, but not a single explanation. More than 30 years later, investigators still cannot say what happened to her. Did she fall into the Mississippi River? Was she murdered? Did she become the victim of a crime no one ever connected to her disappearance? Or did she willingly walk away from her old life and never look back? The mystery remains unsolved. And what makes this story especially haunting is who that young woman was. Because she wasn't just another traveler. She was Ylenia Carrisi, the daughter of Bano and Romina Power, one of the most famous couples in Europe. Millions knew their songs. Millions knew their faces. But when their daughter disappeared, fame proved useless. Money couldn't find her. Influence couldn't find her.
Private investigators couldn't find her. And after decades of searching, nobody has found the truth. This is the story of Ylenia Carrisi, a young woman who spent years searching for freedom and may have disappeared because she finally found it, or because she followed the wrong person while looking for it. From the outside, Ylenia's life looked perfect, almost impossibly perfect. Her father, Ylenia Carrisi, had grown up in poverty in southern Italy. His childhood was difficult. His family worked the land. Nothing was guaranteed. But through determination, talent, and an extraordinary voice, he transformed himself into an international star. Her mother, Romina Power, came from a completely different world, Hollywood. She was the daughter of legendary American actor Tyrone Power, beautiful, charismatic, and already famous in her own right. When Bano and Romina met in the late 1960s, their romance captivated audiences. The poor Italian dreamer, the glamorous American actress. It sounded like a movie script.
Then it became reality. They married. They became one of Europe's most successful musical duos, and in 1970, their first child was born. Ylenia Maria Sole Carrisi, the princess of a modern fairy tale. Or so it seemed. People who knew Ylenia often described her in similar ways. Intelligent, curious, sensitive, independent. She learned languages with remarkable ease. She loved books. She loved writing. She asked difficult questions, the kind of questions that sometimes make adults uncomfortable. Who am I? Why are people unhappy? What does freedom actually mean? What makes a life meaningful? As she grew older, those questions became increasingly important, because Ylenia began noticing something strange. She was surrounded by things most people spent their entire lives chasing: money, security, success, recognition. And yet she wasn't convinced those things made people happy. While millions of young people dreamed of becoming famous, Ylenia had already seen fame from the inside. The interviews, the cameras, the expectations, the constant attention. And she didn't find it particularly interesting. Instead, her attention drifted toward people who lived completely different lives. Street musicians, travelers, drifters, people living on society's edges, people who had nothing. At first glance, it made no sense. Why would the daughter of wealthy celebrities become fascinated by homelessness and poverty? Why romanticize a life that so many people desperately wanted to escape? Her father certainly couldn't understand it. Bano had experienced hardship firsthand. He knew what real poverty looked like. He knew there was nothing glamorous about it. Years later, he would openly admit that he often struggled to understand his daughter. The harder he tried, the more distant she seemed. Not emotionally, but philosophically. It was as though they were looking at the same world and seeing entirely different things. After Ylenia disappeared, her journals suddenly became something they had never been intended to be. Evidence, clues, warnings. Her family read page after page, searching for answers, searching for signs, searching for something that might explain what happened. The journals revealed a young woman caught between two worlds. One was the world she had been born into: luxury, comfort, fame, security. The other was the world she couldn't stop thinking about: people with no security at all, people who lived day by day, people who survived outside the systems most of us depend on. Again and again, Ylenia returned to the same themes: freedom, authenticity, experience. She wanted to understand life beyond privilege. To some readers, her words sounded inspiring. To her parents, they sounded increasingly dangerous. Because there is a point where curiosity becomes obsession.
And looking back, they wondered whether Ylenia had crossed that line. As a teenager, she spent time studying in the United States. She felt deeply connected to her American roots. More connected, perhaps, than anyone around her realized. America represented possibility, reinvention, the chance to become someone new. As she entered adulthood, that attraction only grew stronger. She enrolled at King's College London to study literature. She continued writing, continued traveling, continued searching. But eventually books stopped being enough. She didn't just want to write about people. She wanted to live among them, to understand them, to hear their stories firsthand. And that decision would ultimately change everything. Because sometime in 1993, Ylenia began planning a journey. Not a vacation, not a holiday, a personal mission. She wanted to travel through Central America and the United States, gathering material for a future book. The subject fascinated her. Street musicians, nomads, people living beyond society's expectations. To Ylenia, they represented authenticity. To her parents, they represented risk. But she was 23 years old, no longer a child, no longer someone who could simply be told what to do. So eventually, despite their concerns, they let her go. It would be the last major decision they would ever make as a family. And before the year was over, Ylenia would find herself traveling toward a city that seemed almost designed to attract people like her. A city built on music, mystery, and contradiction. New Orleans. A city where beauty and danger often share the same street. A city where Ylenia would meet a man named Alexander Masekela, and a city from which she would never return. New Orleans. There are cities that people visit, and then there are cities that seem to pull people toward them. New Orleans is one of those cities. Even today, it feels different from the rest of America. But in the early 1990s, the contrast was even stronger. The city had a reputation, a place of music, a place of stories, a place where strangers arrived every day hoping to reinvent themselves. Jazz drifted through the streets long after midnight. Tourists wandered between old buildings stained by humidity and time. Street performers entertained crowds beneath wrought iron balconies. Fortune tellers promised answers. Musicians played for tips. And hidden among all of it was another New Orleans, a darker one. Drug dealers, runaways, homeless wanderers, people running from something, people hiding from something, people who had nowhere else to go. For someone like Ylenia, the city was irresistible. It felt authentic, unfiltered, alive, exactly the kind of place she had spent years dreaming about. What she may not have realized was that authenticity and danger often arrive together. By late 1993, Ylenia had already spent months traveling. The details of her route remain surprisingly unclear. Some reports place her in Belize. Others suggest she moved between Mexico and the United States. Friends and family would later struggle to reconstruct exactly where she had been. The fact that even her final journey remains difficult to map says a great deal about the way she traveled. Lightly. Freely, spontaneously. Unlike many celebrity children, she wasn't moving between luxury hotels and private transportation. She was living more like a backpacker, sometimes taking buses, sometimes staying in inexpensive accommodations, sometimes disappearing from contact for days at a time. The journey wasn't about comfort, it was about experience. At least, that's what she told herself. Months earlier, during a visit to New Orleans with her parents, she had met a man who would later become one of the most controversial figures in the entire case, Alexander Masekela. Even today, nobody seems entirely sure who Masekela really was. Descriptions vary dramatically depending on the source. Some portrayed him as a talented street musician. Others described him as a drifter, a wanderer, a man living on the edges of society. People who knew him often spoke about his unusual charisma. He had the ability to attract attention,
to hold conversations for hours, to make people feel understood, especially young people searching for meaning. And Ylenia was exactly that kind of person. Searching. Always searching. Nobody knows what first drew her to him. The age difference alone was striking. Ylenia was 23. Masekela was decades older. Their lives couldn't have been more different, yet somehow they connected. Perhaps she saw him as a doorway into the world she wanted to understand, a guide to the lives of street musicians and wanderers. Perhaps she believed he possessed some kind of wisdom, or perhaps she simply saw a fascinating story. Whatever the reason, their paths crossed again, and by the end of the year, she was heading back to New Orleans, back toward Masekela, back toward the city that had captured her imagination. Around New Year's Day, 1994, Ylenia checked into the Ledale Hotel. It wasn't glamorous, far from it. The hotel was inexpensive and located near the French Quarter, the kind of place travelers used when they needed a room, not an experience. Years later, journalists would visit the area and struggle to understand why the daughter of wealthy celebrities had chosen to stay there. But anyone who understood Ylenia probably knew the answer, because staying somewhere luxurious would have defeated the purpose. She wasn't trying to experience the world she came from. She was trying to escape it. On January 1st, she called home. The conversation lasted only a few minutes. Her mother, Romina Power, would spend years replaying those moments in her mind. There was nothing unusual about the call. No fear, no distress, no request for help. Ylenia sounded normal, relaxed, comfortable. She told her mother she was in New Orleans. She promised she would call again soon. Romina told her not to wait too long. Ylenia laughed. Then the conversation ended. Neither woman knew it at the time, but those would be the final words they ever exchanged. Years later, Romina would still revisit that moment, not because she believed it contained answers, but because it didn't. There had been no warning, no indication, nothing, just an ordinary conversation, and somehow that made it even more painful. As the days passed, hotel staff observed Ylenia and Masekela together. They came and went regularly, spent long periods outside the hotel, returned in the evenings. To employees, they seemed like two travelers spending time together. Nothing more, nothing unusual, at least at first. Then, some staff members later recalled subtle changes. Ylenia appeared increasingly tired, distracted, less energetic than when she first arrived. These observations would later become controversial. Human memory is imperfect, especially after tragedy. People often reinterpret ordinary details once they know how the story ends. Still, investigators documented every recollection, because in a case with almost no evidence, even small observations mattered. Meanwhile, Ylenia continued writing, like always. The journals she carried everywhere became silent witnesses to her final weeks. When her family later read them, they found the same themes appearing again and again. Freedom, identity, searching, belonging. She seemed fascinated by people living outside conventional society, not because she wanted to become them, but because she believed they possessed something missing from her own life, a kind of honesty, a kind of authenticity. Looking back, some people see idealism in those pages. Others see vulnerability. Perhaps both are true. Because idealistic people are often vulnerable to exactly the kinds of dangers they fail to recognize. Then came January 6th, the day everything ended. Or perhaps the day everything began, depending on how you look at it. According to Alexander Masekela, the two argued. Nobody knows precisely why. The details have never been fully established. What happened next would become one of the most important moments in the entire investigation. Masekela claimed that Ylenia left, walked out, disappeared into the city, and never came back. That was his story. Simple, direct, convenient. Too convenient, some people would later argue. Because when investigators started looking closer, they discovered something troubling. Ylenia may have left the room, but many of her belongings did not. Her clothes remained, her notebooks remained, her camera remained, personal items remained. The room looked less like someone preparing for a journey and more like someone expecting to return. But she never did, and within days, concern would become panic, because Ylenia Carrisi had vanished.
And the only person claiming to know what happened was Alexander Masekela, the last man known to have seen her alive. The last man to see her alive. Every missing person case eventually reaches a point where investigators begin asking the same question. Who was the last person to see them alive? In some cases, the answer is obvious. In others, nobody knows. For Ylenia Carrisi, the answer appeared straightforward. Alexander Masekela, the street musician, the drifter, the man who had spent her final known days in New Orleans, and the man who would spend the next 3 decades at the center of suspicion. Not because investigators could prove he was responsible, but because nobody could explain him. The deeper investigators looked into Masekela, the stranger the picture became. He seemed to exist in fragments. One person described him as intelligent and charismatic. Another described him as unstable. Some saw him as a gifted musician. Others saw him as a manipulator. Rumors surrounded him. Stories followed him. Yet very few facts could be confirmed. Even today, separating reality from mythology is difficult. And perhaps that is one reason why his name still appears whenever Ylenia's disappearance is discussed. Mysteries attract mysteries, and Alexander Masekela seemed to generate them naturally. After Ylenia vanished, police began reconstructing her final days. The process was frustrating from the start. Unlike modern investigations, there were no smartphones, no GPS data, no social media accounts documenting every movement, no digital trail. People could disappear far more easily in 1994, especially travelers moving through cities where nobody knew them. Investigators relied on witnesses, hotel employees, street contacts, conversations, memories. And memories are unreliable, particularly after tragedy. Still, a rough timeline emerged. Ylenia and Masekela had spent much of the previous week together. They had been seen leaving the hotel together, returning together, moving through parts of the city together. Then suddenly, according to Masekela, they argued. Ylenia walked away, and that was the last time he saw her. Police wanted details, specific details. What was the argument about? Where exactly did she go? What was she wearing? Did she mention meeting anyone? Did she seem upset? Afraid? Angry? His answers were frustratingly vague. He insisted he didn't know where she went. He insisted he never saw her again. He insisted that was the truth. And perhaps it was. The problem was that investigators couldn't verify it. There were no witnesses to the argument, no witnesses to her departure, no witnesses who could confirm what happened next. The entire timeline depended largely on one man, a man nobody fully trusted. Then detectives discovered something troubling. After Ylenia disappeared, some of her belongings remained connected to Masekela, particularly financial documents, checks, personal items, things that raised obvious questions. Why was he carrying them? Why hadn't he immediately reported her missing? Why did he appear more concerned about continuing his own life than finding a woman who had suddenly vanished? To investigators, these questions mattered. To Ylenia's family, they were infuriating. The situation felt wrong. Yet, once again, there was a problem. Suspicion isn't evidence. And evidence was precisely what the case lacked. No blood, no crime scene, no eyewitnesses, no body, no confession, nothing. The investigation was already beginning to stall. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, Ylenia's family was entering a nightmare. At first, they assumed there had been some misunderstanding, a delayed phone call, a travel complication, a temporary communication problem. Ylenia had traveled before. She was independent, confident, resourceful. But as days passed, something changed. The silence became impossible to ignore. Every hour felt heavier than the one before it. Eventually, the truth became unavoidable. Something was very wrong. Bano and Romina boarded a plane to New Orleans. Years earlier, they had arrived there as celebrities. Now they arrived as desperate parents. And celebrity status suddenly meant nothing. One of the most striking things about missing person cases is how quickly fame loses its power.
No matter who you are, there comes a point where influence ends and uncertainty begins. This was that point. The famous couple who had performed before enormous crowds now found themselves walking unfamiliar streets holding photographs of their daughter, asking strangers for help, begging for information, searching, always searching. The city that had once fascinated Ylenia now terrified them. Every abandoned building looked suspicious. Every unfamiliar face became a potential witness. Every rumor became a possible lead. For days, they followed whatever information they could find. Some leads pointed toward homeless communities.
Others toward musicians who claimed to know Ylenia.
A few suggested she had left the city voluntarily. Most led nowhere. The pattern quickly became familiar. Hope, then disappointment. Hope, then disappointment. Again and again. What happened next was perhaps the cruelest part of the entire ordeal. The search itself became a trap. Every reported sighting created hope. Every phone call created hope. Every rumor created hope. And almost every one of them collapsed. Someone thought they had seen her in Texas. They hadn't. Someone claimed she was alive in another state. She wasn't. Someone promised information for money. They had nothing. For a brief moment, each lead allowed the family to imagine a reunion. Then reality returned, and they found themselves exactly where they had started, waiting. Again. As the weeks passed, another source of information became increasingly important. Ylenia's journals. The notebooks she had carried during her travels.
The notebooks she had filled with observations, reflections, and thoughts.
Suddenly, those pages mattered in a way she never intended. Her family read them carefully, searching for clues, searching for warnings, searching for anything that could explain what had happened. What they found was not a confession, not a prediction, not a hidden message. What they found was a portrait of a young woman searching for something she struggled to define. Again and again she wrote about freedom, about authenticity, about wanting to understand people living outside society, about wanting experiences that could not be bought. The entries revealed intelligence, sensitivity, idealism, but they also revealed vulnerability. Because people searching for meaning sometimes trust the wrong guides, and that possibility terrified her parents. The more Albano learned about Ylenia's final days, the more disturbed he became.
He began questioning whether she had wandered into a world she didn't fully understand, a world populated by people who did not share her innocence, a world where curiosity could become dangerous, a world where good intentions offered no protection. And at the center of that world stood Alexander Masekela, the last known person to spend significant time with her, the last known person to hear her voice, the last known person to watch her walk away. Or at least, according to him. Because despite everything investigators uncovered, one question remained unanswered. What if Masekela wasn't telling the whole truth? Police couldn't prove he was lying, but they couldn't prove he was telling the truth either. And before investigators could resolve that question, another lead emerged. A witness, a river, and 5 words that would become famous around the world. I belong to the water. The moment those words entered the investigation, everything changed. I belong to the water. The Mississippi River doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care whether you're rich or poor, famous or anonymous, loved or forgotten. It keeps moving, day after day, year after year. And if the most widely accepted theory about Ylenia Carrisi is correct, then somewhere within its enormous currents lies the answer to one of Italy's greatest mysteries. But like almost everything in this case, certainty remains impossible. At some point during the investigation, detectives received a witness statement that would completely change the direction of the case. The witness claimed he had seen a young blonde woman near the Mississippi River during the early hours of January 6, 1994. The timing immediately caught investigators' attention. This was the exact period when Ylenia disappeared. The witness described a woman who seemed detached, distracted, lost in thought,
Perhaps distressed, perhaps exhausted, perhaps under the influence of something. Nobody knew.
The witness himself couldn't say. He simply remembered feeling concerned enough to approach her. According to his account, he tried warning her. The river was dangerous, especially at night, especially in winter. People underestimated it all the time. Some never came back. Then came the sentence that would become legendary. A sentence repeated in newspapers, documentaries, books, and television programs for decades. According to the witness, the young woman replied, "I belong to the water." And then she moved toward the river. It sounds like something written for a movie, which is precisely why some people doubt it. Real life rarely produces lines that dramatic. Yet the witness maintained his account, and investigators took it seriously. Because while the words themselves may sound poetic, the circumstances did not. A lone young woman, a dark river, a disappearance. Nothing about that combination was comforting. There was another reason detectives paid attention. The Mississippi River is not merely dangerous, it is unforgiving. The average person looking at the river sees calm water, but appearances are deceptive. Beneath the surface lies an enormous force, powerful currents, changing depths, underwater obstacles, heavy commercial traffic. Even experienced swimmers can find themselves in trouble surprisingly quickly, and when people disappear in the Mississippi, recovery is not guaranteed. Bodies have vanished before, some are recovered miles away, some are never found at all. Investigators knew this, which meant one deeply frustrating possibility had to be considered. If Ylenia entered the river, her body might never be recovered. Ever. At first, many people resisted the theory, including members of her own family, because the witness had one major problem. He couldn't positively identify Ylenia. He believed the woman resembled her, but resemblance isn't certainty, especially at night, especially years later. This distinction would become one of the most important weaknesses in the entire theory. Because if the witness was mistaken, everything built upon his statement collapsed immediately. The woman could have been someone else entirely. New Orleans was full of travelers, full of young women, full of strangers, and mistaken identity is not uncommon. Yet despite those concerns, investigators kept returning to the same question. If it wasn't Ylenia, then where was she? As months turned into years, the river theory slowly gained strength. Not because new evidence emerged, but because no alternative explanation emerged either. No verified sightings, no confirmed phone calls, no financial activity, no letters, no messages, nothing. The world seemed to swallow Ylenia whole, and the longer that silence lasted, the more plausible the river explanation appeared. To some people, it became the only explanation, including, eventually, her father. For Albano, accepting the possibility was devastating. But grief often forces impossible choices. After years of searching, he found himself confronting a reality that many families of missing people face. At some point, hope becomes painful. Not comforting, painful. Every new lead raises expectations. Every disappointment crushes them again. And eventually, some people reach a point where they need an answer, even if the answer hurts. Over time, Albano came to believe that the Mississippi River likely held the truth. Not because he wanted to, because he could see no other explanation supported by evidence. Or rather, by the lack of evidence. To him, the silence itself had become evidence. Romina Power saw things very differently. For her, the absence of a body changed everything. No body meant no certainty. No certainty meant no ending. And no ending meant hope remained possible. Even if only barely. Years later, she would continue speaking publicly about her daughter. Continue searching. Continue believing. Not necessarily because she possessed proof, but because mothers rarely surrender hope willingly, especially when no one can prove that hope is wrong. As time passed, the disagreement grew into something larger than a theory. It became two completely different ways of surviving the same tragedy. Albano believed Ylenia was gone. Romina believed she might still be alive. Neither could prove their position. Neither could fully accept the others. And somewhere between those two realities, their family remained trapped.
for years, for decades. But there was another reason Romina struggled to accept the river theory. Because when she looked back at Ylenia's journals, she didn't see a woman preparing to die. She saw a woman searching for life, searching for meaning, searching for experiences. The entries revealed confusion, curiosity, idealism, sometimes recklessness, but not surrender, not finality. To Romina, the journals felt inconsistent with the image of a young woman voluntarily entering the river. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps she wasn't. The truth remains unknown, and that uncertainty created a problem investigators could never solve. Every theory explained part of the story. None explained all of it. The river theory explained why no trace of Ylenia was ever found, but it depended on an uncertain identification. The crime theory explained the suspicious circumstances surrounding her disappearance, but it lacked evidence. The voluntary disappearance theory fit aspects of her personality, but it required an almost impossible level of secrecy. Every explanation had strengths. Every explanation had weaknesses. And after years of investigation, nobody could determine which weakness mattered most. Then came another twist, a confession, a potential breakthrough, the kind of development that can suddenly solve a cold case, or make it even more confusing. For a brief moment, investigators believed they might finally learn what happened to Ylenia Carrisi. Instead, the mystery became even deeper. The confession, the divorce, and the endless search. For years, the investigation went nowhere. No body, no witnesses, no confirmed sightings. Nothing. Then, suddenly, a potential breakthrough appeared. The kind of breakthrough every family of a missing person both hopes for and fears. A confession. At some point during the years following Ylenia's disappearance, investigators encountered a man who claimed he knew what had happened. Not just any man, a serial killer. A man already responsible for multiple murders. Someone capable of terrible things. According to reports, he claimed that years earlier he had killed a young woman resembling Ylenia and buried her body. For the first time in a long time, investigators had something tangible, a location, a story, a possibility. The family followed the developments closely. Maybe this was finally it. Maybe the nightmare was ending. Maybe they would finally know. Even terrible certainty can be easier than endless uncertainty. At least certainty allows grief to move forward. Investigators examined the claim, compared evidence, checked timelines, reviewed details, and eventually the truth emerged. The victim existed. The body existed. The murder existed. But the victim was not Ylenia Carrisi. The confession had nothing to do with her disappearance. Another door closed. Another lead vanished. Another opportunity for answers disappeared forever. The mystery survived once again. Years continued to pass. The search became quieter, then quieter still. The media gradually moved on. New crimes replaced old ones. New mysteries captured public attention. But for Ylenia's family, time did not solve anything. Because missing persons cases do not end when newspapers stop writing about them. They continue every day, every birthday, every holiday, every family gathering, every empty chair. The absence never leaves. It simply becomes part of life. For Bano and Romina, the disappearance affected everything, including their marriage. Many people later assumed that Ylenia's disappearance directly caused their divorce. The reality appears more complicated. Problems already existed. Tensions already existed. The relationship had been under strain before January 1994. But tragedy has a way of widening existing cracks, especially when people grieve differently. And Bano and Romina could not have grieved more differently. Over time, Bano moved toward acceptance, not peace, acceptance. There is a difference. Peace suggests healing. Acceptance simply means acknowledging what you believe is true. He came to believe that Ylenia likely died in the Mississippi River. The conclusion brought pain, but it also brought something else. An ending. a way to stop searching, a way to stop waiting for the phone to ring, a way to stop expecting miracles. For Albano, continuing to search forever felt impossible. At some point, he needed reality, however painful, to replace uncertainty. Romina could not follow him there. And perhaps she never will. For her, acceptance felt premature. How could anyone declare the story finished without a body, without proof, without certainty? Again and again she returned to the same question. What if everyone was wrong? What if Ylenia was still alive? What if she was somewhere in the world unable to come home, or unwilling to? The possibilities were unlikely, but unlikely and impossible are not the same thing. And for a mother, that distinction can mean everything. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of all is that Ylenia's disappearance created two separate realities. In one reality, she died in New Orleans in January 1994. The river took her. The search ended. Only grief remained. In the other reality, she survived. Somewhere, somehow, waiting to be found. Neither reality could be proven. Neither could be disproven. And so her parents spent decades trapped between hope and loss, between possibility and acceptance, between two versions of the same tragedy. Then, nearly 20 years after Ylenia vanished, a court made a decision. In 2013, she was officially declared legally dead. From a legal perspective, the case had finally reached its conclusion. The paperwork was completed, the records were updated, the state had made its decision. But legal decisions do not create emotional closure. A document cannot explain what happened. A court order cannot reveal the truth. And a declaration cannot answer the question that had haunted her family since 1994. Where is Ylenia? Even today, nobody knows. Not investigators, not journalists, not her family, not the countless people who have studied the case over the decades. The mystery remains exactly where it began, in the dark spaces between evidence and speculation, between facts and theories, between hope and grief. Epilogue. Today, tourists still walk through the French Quarter. Musicians still perform beneath the balconies. Street lights still reflect on the Mississippi River after midnight. The city is different now, but in some ways, it remains exactly the same. Somewhere in old photographs, Ylenia Carrisi is forever 23 years old, smiling, curious, standing at the beginning of a life that seemed filled with possibility. She wanted adventure. She wanted freedom. She wanted to understand people whose lives were completely different from her own. She wanted to find something authentic, something real. Instead, she became a mystery herself, a daughter, a traveler, a writer, a missing person. And perhaps that is why her story continues to resonate decades later. Because this case isn't really about celebrity. It isn't even about crime. It's about uncertainty, about what happens when a person disappears so completely that even their ending becomes unknowable. Most missing persons cases eventually provide an answer, a body, an arrest, a confession, a discovery, something. This case never did. And so, more than 30 years later, one question remains. What happened to Ylenia Carrisi on that January night in New Orleans? Did the Mississippi River claim her? Did she encounter someone dangerous? Did she choose a new life beyond the reach of her famous name? Or is the truth something nobody has even considered? Somewhere, perhaps, the answer still exists, hidden in a memory, hidden in a secret, or hidden forever. And until that answer is found, Ylenia Carrisi remains exactly what she became in January 1994, one of the most enduring missing person mysteries in modern history.